Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's lecture. My name is Darren Dochuk, and along with David Lantigua, I'm co-director of the Kushwa Center for the Study of American Catholicism and also a member of the faculty in Notre Dame's Department of History. I want to thank you all for joining us on this frosty Wednesday afternoon. It's nice and cozy here. And I also want to thank our co-sponsors, the Departments of American Studies and History and the Center for Social Concerns. Thanks to Shane and Madonna for coordinating this event. We're fortunate to welcome Jonathan Ebel as our speaker today. He is professor of religion and head of the Department of Religion at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and a respected scholar in the study of American religion. Since receiving his PhD from the University of Chicago, he has published numerous articles, book chapters, and books dealing with religion and war, religion and violence, and lay theologies of economic hardship, which we'll hear more about today. His most recent book, from which his lecture today is drawn, is From Dust They Came, Government Camps and the Religion of Reform in New Deal, California, which was published just last year by New York University Press. It has already generated considerable interest and praise, evidenced in part by the author meets critics, or really author meets fans. Book panels have celebrated this book at the most recent annual meetings, both of the American Academy of Religion and the American Society of Church History. Ebel is also the author of GI Messiahs, Soldiering, War, and American Civil Religion, published by Yale Press in 2015, and Faith in the Fight, Religion and the American Soldier in the Great War, published by Princeton Press in 2010. He's also the co-editor of From Jeremiad to Jihad, Religion, Violence in America, which was published by University of California Press in 2012. Each one of these exceptional books testify to Dr. Ebel's rare abilities with the pen. I have assigned Faith in the Fight to grad classes, not just because of its smart analysis, which is clear on every page, but also because of its seamless prose. The book draws on World War I soldiers' correspondence to capture the religious meaning and experience of battle. These were written with an elegance typical of the day, especially among the officer class. Most historians would have been daunted by the prospect of writing about and alongside such skilled battlefield poets, but Ebel matched their penmanship at each step along the way. Those of you who are part of the chorus session at noon today workshopping some of Dr. Ebel's new work know what I'm saying when we focus on the prose itself. Professor Ebel is also a highly respected leader. This is why he was elected president of the American Society of Church History, a duty that he has just completed, and chosen as faculty mentor for the current cohort of the Young Scholars in American Religion program. It is also why he was urged to run in 2018 for election to the U.S. House of Representatives. Having spent considerable time in the Navy, as well as the Academy, Professor Ebel's record of service to community is as well-rounded and as stellar as they come. Supported over the years by several national fellowships, including a Guggenheim in 2017, Jonathan Ebel is currently working on a religious history of American warfare, told in 5 weapons. The title of his talk this afternoon is From Dust They Came, Migration, Sanitation, and Missionary Modernity in New Deal, California. Please join me in welcoming Professor Jonathan Ebel.
Wow, Darren. Thank you. I don't know what to say. That was such a generous introduction, and it is such an honor to be here today to share some research and have a conversation about this recent book. Thank you to you, Darren, to the Kushwa Center, to Ella, and to Townsend, and Cora for a wonderful lunchtime conversation today. It's just been an amazing experience so far, and such a privilege. I'm I'm going to walk you through some kind of general insights, guiding thoughts before I get into the meat of the content of my talk today. I spent roughly the last 14 years thinking about the Great Depression off and on as a subject of study for someone interested in the study of religion, been interested in how the people who were most affected by it, and also the federal government, which comprises people who were affected by it, responded to deteriorating circumstances and to a developing awareness of deteriorations that had already gone on. And so that constituted a significant part of my sort of the stuff that I was working with, the stuff that I was thinking about. And it's a big area. It's a big thing to think with, the Great Depression. My focus, the thing that interested me most, was the state of California as a location, and also agriculture in California. It seemed to me that this was an interesting way to think about the intersection of religion with a wide range of things. Of course, the practice of agriculture, but also land ownership, land management, poverty and wealth, movement and fixity, and programs of philosophies of reform. And this slide here on the right-hand side shows a map that was created as part of a proposal from what was then the Resettlement Administration for a network of camps that they proposed to build along major routes of worker migration. And that became the focus of this book, those camps, which, as I will say again here shortly, I argue are interesting to think about as missionary sites where evangelization is going on in many different forms. So this is a representation of the landscape that I was thinking about and thinking with. And one of the quotes, I'm going to present you with a couple of quotes here before we really get rolling. The first, which I will refer to again later in the talk, is from Mary Douglas's classic work, Purity and Danger, in which she points out the construction of dirt. As we know it, dirt is essentially disorder. There is no such thing as absolute dirt. It exists in the eye of the beholder. And for this purposes of this paper and also the larger project of which it's a part, this is kind of scripture. There's some capital T truth that is represented in this quote. But now I want to pivot to another quote that is from Christian and Jewish scripture, from the book of Genesis, chapter 2, verse 7. And the Lord formed man of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. And man became a living soul. So the creation of humanity, as narrated in Genesis 2, involves two elements: dust of the ground and the breath of life. The author of these words saw primeval man himself and those around him as in some way descended from earth, perhaps even from dirt. For in the moments before God breathed into those earthen nostrils and made man a living soul, The dust of the ground stood apart from the ground, molded by the Lord God, and on its way to another state, but temporarily out of place. These are the ideas of a society that sees an intimate connection between humanity and soil. Modern America's relationship to the dust of the ground has often been imagined differently. After nearly a century and a half of steady movement away from agricultural living, it is common for Americans to see soil as dirt, dirt as a contaminant, and the removal of dirt from human environs and human bodies as both a ritual necessity and a ritual imperative, a moral imperative. Old ways of seeing aren't easily swept away, though, and as Americans sought to make sense of the Great Depression, its effects, and what economic calamity revealed about the nation, some turned again to words that implied an intimacy between humanity and the dust of the ground. Human erosion, one of the most memorable phrases used to describe the human tragedies of the Great Depression, analogizes both a people and a person to soil. In the former case, it evokes a people dislodged. In the latter, a person diminished. The most widely disseminated instance of the phrase, and to my knowledge, its first use, came in 1939 with the publication of American Exodus, an account of human erosion, by Paul Taylor and Dorothea Lange. This terse, elegant volume of prose and photography is dominated by images and narratives of a people pushed across land by forces far larger and more powerful than they. What can they do in response to these forces but let go and be swept away, swirl in temporary eddies, cling to roadsides, ditch banks, any place where work or nourishment might appear? When another sheltering obstacle to the currents of need gives way, people are pulled back into the flow like so much eroded earth. Paul Taylor described the dynamics, quote, "Cut from the land by illness, driven to the road by poverty, they walk from county to county in search of the meager security of relief," unquote. The searching, the movement, and the myriad destinations added up to human erosion because volition was largely irrelevant. The father of a family of 9 from Paris, Arkansas, conveyed this when he spoke to Taylor in June of 1938 near Weber Falls, Oklahoma. Quote, "We're bound for Kingfisher, Oklahoma to work in the wheat, and Lubbock, Texas to work in the cotton. We're trying not to, but we'll be in California yet," unquote. They wanted to stay put, or at least to limit their downstream travel, but the currents pulling them were simply too strong. Erosion was inevitable. Growers, new dealers, and agricultural workers in California noted that the migrants who came to rest in towns like Thermal, Wasco, and El Centro were out of place. Having been lifted up and swept along by the forces of the Depression, they gathered in unintentional communities at the margins of society. They forged makeshift shelters and lived unsightly lives. The erosion of a person, while clearly related to Depression-era crises, is a different and altogether more intimate process. This erosion is of the body and the psyche. It eats away at standards, expectations, and inhibitions. It is characterized by economic catastrophe, by the pressure of ever-increasing need and ever-declining resources, by the drip, drip, drip of disappointment, inability, and shortfall. Toward Farm Security, a 1942 handbook for Farm Security Administration employees used the phrase human erosion in this personal vividly diagnostic sense, quote, "These are the common symptoms of human erosion. Poor housing, inadequate and insufficient food, poor health, lack of educational opportunities, and a loss of hope and faith bred of despair," unquote. Teleology here is worth noting. Erosion is a condition that manifests in this litany of losses. It is not the losses that bring on erosion. Cross-country movement is not a necessary consequence of this erosion. The settled, impoverished are as likely to be eroded as the unsettled, the displaced. The author continues, quote, "Rural poverty makes slaves of free men. It weakens the strong and turns their faces to the wall where they can see no horizon, either on the skyline or the landscape," unquote. This erosion undoes a person, and as we see in the references to slavery and freedom, undermines both history and privilege, leaving its victims in bonds regardless of race. As experienced and encountered in agricultural California, these two types of human erosion, of a people and of a person, combine to undo the work attributed to God in Genesis 2. Migrants' bodies became mixtures of living flesh and dead ancestral dust. Erosion left them powerless for months on end to do anything to clean themselves, and in some cases made them forgetful of what it meant to be clean. Beginning in 1935, the federal government partnered with California-based reformers and the State Emergency Relief Administration to build and operate a series of camps up and down the state's agricultural valleys, metaphorical retaining walls, if you will, against human erosion, sites on which people and a people could be rebuilt, rehabilitated, redeemed. The built environment of these camps was, I argue, central to their program of redemption. This is an argument that I make in book form in the recently published From Dust They Came, attending to the meaning and function of elements of the camp gate, the camp office, the tent platform, which is what migrants use to establish a domestic space, the sanitary unit, the camp community center, and the camp paper. Today, I want to take the history of the migrant camp sanitary unit as an opportunity to delve into the functioning of these federal government camps for Dust Bowl migrants as missionary spaces, and to reflect on the discourses and practices surrounding dirt and cleanliness, contamination, purity, as they operated in agricultural California during the Great Depression. Camp managers and members of the communities surrounding the camps worried about migrants' bodies, the dirt that was on them, and the waste that came from them. They worried because they wanted migrants to be clean and to value cleanliness, and because they wanted to avoid contamination, both biological and moral. Modern sanitation systems appeared to solve the interwoven crises of disordered people and disordered matter. But they neither fulfilled their promise in the moment, nor worked their way free of the religio-cultural concerns about social and economic contamination. Always woven through local and federal concerns about the spread of biological contaminants were notions of social order, boundary, and belonging that are every bit as important to understanding the sanitary unit as our ideas about how properly to dispose of human waste. At least a few Dust Bowl migrants encountered a government camp's sanitary unit before laying eyes on the tent platform or interacting meaningfully with the camp manager in his office. Sanitary units, sometimes called utility buildings, housed the camp's toilets. They were also where migrants found showers, sinks, and wash tubs. A long and unrelieved trip to a government camp likely sent at least some migrants straight for the sanitary unit upon arrival. This likely would have pleased camp staff. Proper use of the sanitary units was an urgent missionary goal of the camp program from the very beginning. And I just want to point out here that large building that's in the center of this picture is the sanitary unit. So you can see it's centrally located, at least in that shot. As a migrant family settled into life in a federal camp, they would have grown increasingly familiar with the sanitary unit. If they were reluctant to interact with its conveniences, they could not have missed the structure itself. In describing the Arvin camp layout as part of his summer 1936 inspection, Herbert Mensing noted that the camp's grounds were divided into 3 plots measuring roughly 250 feet on each side, quote, in the middle of which stands a utility building or sanitary unit, unquote. Each sanitary unit, he continued, served 32 tent platforms. Quote, the women's section contains 4 cement laundry trays, 6 showers with hot and cold water and dressing rooms, 6 toilets, and a galvanized iron wash sink. The men's section contains only 2 laundry trays, 4 toilets, and a 6-foot urinal trough, unquote. These structures and their technologies were both mundane and central to camp life. Moreover, given the near constant attention that camp officials paid to issues of hygiene and sanitation, it is clear that camp rituals of purity and the spaces provided for their practice must be read as foundational to the system's understanding of the cosmos, as central to its modern religiosity. The sanitary unit was a catechetical space, a space of performance and of evaluation. It was an obvious location for the practice of biopolitics, that is, the exercise of power and the enforcement of norms on, through, and around the body. The sanitary unit was also an unlikely location for the practice of electoral politics. Each migrant camp was divided into sub-communities based on the number of sanitary units it contained. Camp constitutions, like the one adopted by the Camp Council at Brawley, described the system and its structure. Quote, 4 members shall be elected to the community council from each unit. A unit shall be a political subdivision of the community council, the boundaries and/or extent of which shall be as follows, and the following passages in all caps in the actual Constitution. The utility buildings shall be numbered from the 1 on the southwest as number 1 clockwise to number 5 on the southeast. Those platforms around each utility shall be considered part of that unit, unquote. Camp residents organized, petitioned, voted, and stood for election based on where they showered, shaved, and, in theory at least, peed. Gathering migrants in a camp and housing them on tent platforms made the sanitary unit necessary. Without some communal space for maintaining the body and disposing of its wastes, the camp program, with concentrations of people in rudimentary dwellings, would have been recreating, perhaps intensifying, the messes its visionaries sought to clean up. The theological anthropology and the cosmology of the camp system also made the sanitary unit necessary. With such a strong connection asserted between the clean and the righteous, and a persistent, pervasive insistence on the correspondence between exterior and interior states, federal migrant camps had to provide technologies for the orderly management of bodily dirt. Good people who inhabited clean homes could not have dirty bodies or be careless in the management of their waste. An item submitted to the Arvin camp's Tow Sack Tabler, its weekly newspaper, in November of 1932 by a representative of the Kern County Health Department put this rather succinctly. Quote, each week there has been something in the paper about keeping our houses clean. I would like to say something today about keeping our bodies clean. Just as no one likes to be in or look at a dirty house, no one likes to be in the company of a person with a dirty body. I indicated earlier, I found the insights of Mary Douglas in her classic study, Purity and Danger, particularly useful in thinking all of this through. And just to remind you, she argued that we need to approach dirt critically, quoting again, as we know it, dirt is essentially disorder. There is no such thing as absolute dirt. It exists in the eye of the beholder. California's agricultural society in 1930 was especially prone to and anxious about the kinds of ambiguity that Douglas wants us to notice. The agricultural economy of California's interior was built on at least 3 ambiguous elements: soil, fertilizer, and migratory labor. Remove these from their proper places. Alter the gaze of the beholder with something as predictable as a change in the seasons. And these essential elements become dirt, shit, and outsiders. A resident of the Indio camp wrote to the weekly paper, The Migratory Worker, describing this transformation. She called her piece, quote, a 2-act play with but 3 characters, unquote. In it, a local boy points out a bum, he says, to his mother. She responds that the man isn't a bum. He's a cotton picker. 2 months later, with the cotton picked, the same boy points out the same man and calls him a cotton picker. Quoting from the 2-act play, mother answers, that isn't a cotton picker, dear, that's a bum. Unquote. Attempts to manage the ambiguity of these and other elements to define and enforce place were connected, and I believe very much at the heart of exercises of government power inside and outside the camp gate. At stake in naming a person a cotton picker or a bum, in proclaiming the glories of the soil or demanding that dirt be removed from the body, was the ordered purity of California's agricultural communities and control of the migrant bodies that flowed through and around them. So now we're going to move geographically down to the Imperial Valley. The Imperial Valley in far southern California has 2 key ingredients for large-scale agriculture: mineral-rich soil and year-round sun. What it lacks is water. In the closing decades of the 19th century, state, local, and corporate interests worked together to create a series of canals to divert waters from the Colorado River to the previously sere landscape. From 1895 through 1905, the promise of irrigated farmland drew homesteaders to the region with dreams of making their fortune as growers. But the waters of the Colorado River, the same waters that made the desert bloom, were inconsiderate of those dreams. In 1905, heavy rains in the mountains raised the Colorado to such a level that it breached the canal gates, blew out a newly created irrigation cut, and began to rip through the Imperial Valley with its full force. The rerouted Colorado River inundated the region, flooding 2 ancient riverbeds, today's Alamo and New Rivers, and creating California's largest inland body of water, the Salton Sea. 2.5 decades after the Imperial Valley had been submerged by the technology that brought it life, Imperial County had become an agricultural powerhouse. A visitor wrote in 1936, quote, within its 4,000 square miles, there is the largest irrigation project in the world, bringing year-round water to irrigate more than 600,000 acres. Imperial County produces the world's most important lettuce and melon crop, unquote. In 1933, as Imperial County faced the early stages of a human flood and related acts of labor unrest, county authorities penned Ordinance 101, an official attempt to defend communal purity. The ordinance imagines and regulates actions that pollute a community's resources. In the process, it imagines the actors who pollute and, through its content and structure, reduces those people to a pollutant to be contained. Tellingly, the focus of Ordinance 101 shifts back and forth between migrants and livestock, stipulating conditions for the housing of the former, laying out guidelines for the handling of the latter, betraying all along the ambiguous humanity of the migratory laborer in the local imagination. Section 101 of Ordinance, or Section 1 of Ordinance 101 mandates that a dead animal must be buried under at least 3 feet of soil and more than 100 feet from a source of drinking water. Section 2, I'm just going to advance to a quick slide here so you can have a new visual. Section 2 reads, quote, "It shall be unlawful for any privy or other receptacle for human excrement to be so constituted and maintained as to permit flies to gain access to the excremental matter therein, or to permit such excremental matter to float over or upon the surface of the ground, or to permit or allow any privy vault, privy cesspool, water closet, septic tank, or other receptacle for human excrement to be or remain within 50 feet of any canal, stream, pond, lake, or reservoir from which water is or may be drawn for the domestic use of any portion of the inhabitants of the county," unquote. The very next section of the ordinance, Section 3, turns back to animals. It prohibits the keeping of livestock, quote, "within 50 feet of any canal, stream, pond, lake, or reservoir from which water is or may be drawn for the domestic use of any portion of the inhabitants of the county," unquote. Section 4 places a similar stricture on human subjects, quote, "It shall be unlawful for any person or persons to camp or to establish and or maintain a camp within a distance of 40 feet of any canal, stream, pond, lake, or reservoir," unquote. Ordinance 101 seeks to maintain communal purity by managing 2 dangers. The first and most obvious is biological contamination. Bacteria that might spread beyond a marginal subcommunity, whether bovine or human. Decomposing cow flesh might make its way into the water and onto the lettuce crop. Flies might carry bacteria from an ad hoc privy up, out, and into the world of those who use porcelain toilets. The force of law stands ready to punish those who are party to such violations. The second danger that the ordinance addresses is that of the unmoored wandering being, the person or animal whose free movement might pollute the community's resources or violate the community's boundaries. Herds of livestock and groups of migrants could not be just anywhere and be legal. They had to stay in place, and that place had to be 50 and 40 feet, respectively, from the county's valuable water resources. Section 4 makes migrants' circumstances their own legal responsibility. They must dig a hole and go in it. They must know their place and stay in it. The migrant's status before the law was thus somewhere between a Holstein and a respectable white citizen. The law understood that, unlike cows, migrants could develop some scruples regarding the when and where of defecation. But in contrast to the settled men and women of Imperial County, the law was almost literally in the migrant's shit. Migrants could defecate here, but not there. If flies found a migrant's excrement, the migrant might find himself under arrest. Ordinance 101 acknowledged that landed residents exercised power over migrants. It then invoked migrants' humanity not as a reflection of the freedoms they possessed or the countervailing rights that they might invoke in their defense, but as a prelude to punishment for willfully polluting a community in which their belonging was always and everywhere circumscribed. The boundary most obviously present in Ordinance 101, the boundary that legitimates the boundaries drawn around irrigation ditches and the like, is the class boundary. The population targeted by Ordinance 101 consists of those too poor to live fully settled lives, or to always dispose of their waste in ways seen as proper. But this boundary was thickened by another. The economic realities of Imperial County agriculture in the early 1930s, white and Japanese landowners, Mexican, African American, and Filipino workers were such that class and race were always co-constituted, if not completely coterminous. Laws such as Ordinance 101 affected the poor and the dark-skinned more than the rich and the light. Ordinance 101 gave authorities a set of portable boundaries to impose on those who moved beyond the familiar geographic boundaries and the power to punish those who violated them. On a moment's notice, deputies could remind human contaminants of their place and make them pay for forgetting it. The arrival of a largely white population of impoverished workers complicated these boundaries. White bodies ought to be clean. White waste ought to be managed. But destitution and desperation and starvation eroded these markers and the critical distinctions in which they were rooted. In traceable ways, this re-racialization mobilized the federal government to undertake the migrant camp project. Now, when a migrant family moved through a camp gate and recreated recognizably domestic space on the aforementioned tent platform, they passed from an environment that was primarily punitive and secondarily catechetical to one that was primarily catechetical and secondarily punitive. They freed themselves from the potential harassment of local authorities, but came under the watchful and critical eye of the camp manager. They also came into contact with the sanitary unit and its modern technologies and engineered systems for receiving and disposing of their waste. I'm going to grab a little bit more water at this point. I'm sorry if this is a little bit gross. It's important to talk about. And we're just getting started. So in December of 1937, C.G. Gillespie, chief of the Bureau of Sanitary Engineering for the state of California, paid a visit to the new migratory farm labor camp in Brawley. Many locals, so Brawley is located in Imperial County. Many locals had resisted the project, feeling, in the words of one, that, quote, the establishment of such a camp would tend to draw thereto migratory and itinerant persons who are not actually seeking employment and who would be a disturbing element within our county, unquote. But a mixture of charm, economic logic, and governmental power cleared most obstacles, and in December of 1937, the federal camp was not just open, it was filled to capacity. Whatever sense of accomplishment Gillespie and camp manager Charles Berry felt about the new camp didn't last long. Shortly after his December visit, Gillespie wrote to his boss, Jonathan Garst, who was the director of the Region 9 Farm Security Administration, reporting on what he called a disturbing condition at the Brawley camp. I'm going to quote extensively from that letter now. I visited the camp last week and learned that one of the very first problems Mr. Berry had was the defecation of the occupants in an irrigation ditch that supplies several farmers with water. Unfortunately, the camp was laid out so close to this ditch that there is only a roadway and then a narrow space of a few feet between the road and the ditch. As a result, evidently, scores of the occupants go over into this ditch to defecate. Mr. Berry has had quite a time burying the material, but I asked him to shovel it out of the ditch and bury it on the banks, and he agreed to keep a guard along the ditch or else to move the occupants to the opposite side of the grounds, unquote. Garst acknowledged receipt of Gillespie's letter and advised him that one of his best employees, Omer Mills, an economist by training, was willing to give his personal attention to the nuisances committed by campers along the irrigation ditch. That's a quote from Garst's letter. According to Gillespie, this was not a small-scale problem. Scores of camp residents were committing such nuisances. And while Charles Berry was surely bothered by the addition to his job description, the situation must have been especially frustrating to Gillespie. He could review and approve construction plans for as many sanitary systems for these camps as he wanted. None of it mattered if the appeal of a modern toilet couldn't overcome the familiarity and the convenience of an easily accessible ditch. As much as camp officials might have prayed this was an isolated situation, one that a guard and a fence and a well-placed sign could remedy, it was not. In early reports from Marysville and Arvin, camp manager Tom Collins told stories of migrants being flummoxed by the flush toilets. In March of 1936, at the Arvin camp, Collins was inspecting a sanitary unit on a Friday night when he found a little girl, quote, sitting right in the toilet bowl, splashing water with her hands and feet and giggling and laughing, unquote. Later in the year, he discovered an adult woman, quote, our new neighbor from Arkansas, sitting on the concrete floor, legs stretched on both sides of the toilet bowl. Beside her was a pile of freshly laundered clothing. In the bowl was more clothing, unquote. Collins reported in January of 1936 that, quoting again, eternal vigilance is necessary to keep the campers interested in this important part of the camp program. Regulations and reports penned by migrants themselves indicate that the problem of misuse was pervasive and persistent. S.E. Easton, who represented Sanitary Unit 3 in the Arvin Camp Council, wrote to his constituents sometime in 1936 to, quote, please instruct your children not to stand on the toilet bowls or seats and not to hang on the showers, unquote. He also asked that, quote, when toilet paper is exhausted, campers please call at the office for another supply. Do not use newspaper or wrapping paper in the toilets, unquote. One ordinance passed by the Camp Council of the Indio Camp in January of 1941 forbid, quote, standing on toilet seats, unquote. Another banned children under the age of 6 from the sanitary unit building, unless accompanied by a parent. Nobody could take for granted that camp residents would see the sanitary unit as useful, much less desirable. The missionary task was to convince all residents that something vital was at stake in following the proper modern scripts of rituals of purity and impurity, and in treating the space for those rituals properly. The struggle over the proper use of the sanitary unit was especially public and therefore especially noticeable at the Arvin camp under the management of Fred Ross, roughly 1939 through 1941. His accounts of the situation, his guidance, and his frustration frequently appeared in the Tosac Tattler, the camp's weekly newspaper. Manager Ross wrote both gently and forcefully. He sometimes created characters and dialogues intended to reflect the perspectives of camp residents. His evangelistic approach was multi-pronged but unified in its underlying message. Belonging in the camp community depended upon accepting the official view of sanitation and adopting the attitudes and practices the manager prescribed. In October of 1939, Fred Ross wrote an open letter to the residents of the Arvin camp, titled New Cleanup Schedule. All was not well around the sanitary units. Quote, "Well, folks, I didn't think it would ever come to this. I sort of hoped that you could reason with people and show them that certain things just had to be done around the camp for the benefit of everyone living in the camp, and that everyone would go ahead and do those things, sort of natural-like," unquote. Ross was referring to residents' refusal to clean the sanitary unit when their turn came around. Those who didn't like the system, he continued, could, quote, just move off the property. As vexing as the failure to clean sanitary units was to Ross, the nature of the mess was more troubling still. Slipping into a less censorious voice, Ross raised the topic of the misuse of toilets. The offenders, he was sure, were children. Quote, "A kid can get into a heap more trouble accidental-like than a grown-up can on purpose, but when a kid sets about doing something on purpose, look out. There's no knowing where it will end," unquote. Ross sensed that the violators of sanitary unit ritual were willful, and he promised to punish them if they continued. Quote, "There's some little girls in Unit 1 and Unit 2 who had better learn pretty pronto that the utility building floor is to be walked on, not jobbed on. And just last night, some little girl did a nasty trick on the wall and all over the toilet box in number 2 utility building. That's the sort of thing dogs do that ain't housebroke," unquote. Ross wrote further that he and the camp guard, Sam Trask, would be watching for, quote, "little girls up to any more of these jobs," unquote, and would treat them the same way one treats, quote, "little dogs when they do anything like that around the house," unquote. Though the euphemisms jobs and jobbing are nonspecific and, to my ear at least, somewhat odd, the context makes it clear that what they referred to belonged within the toilet. Ross's threats of corporal punishment, however serious, were ineffective. 2 weeks later, he used his weekly letter in the paper to excoriate the offenders and their irresponsible parents. Quote, "Well, folks, we've joked and explained and cleaned up, warned and explained, but we still haven't gotten the job done. Some children are still getting their jobs done all over the floor in the utility building," unquote. From Ross's perspective, there were a number of different explanations that could account for this persistent trouble. Quoting again, "Either the children are too short to reach the toilet seats or too narrow to sit on them once they reach them, or they're big enough both ways but just don't care or don't know any better," unquote. The fault, irrespective of the reason for the job ending up on the floor, rested with the parents. The solution was their responsibility as well. Quote, "If your children are too small to do the job where it is supposed to be done, it is to you mothers and fathers to take them over to the utility buildings and to see that everything comes out all right. If your children don't know any better or just don't care, you mothers and fathers will be expected to explain to them about all the whys and wherefores of clean toilets and to see to it that they do know and do care about it." If the voice of the camp manager wasn't enough to reform migrant behavior, perhaps the power of the state would be. Ross made clear that if children could not place their waste properly, the consequences could be dire. Quote, "The Kern County Health Department has requested names of every family whose children are messing up the toilet floors. The parents will be held responsible for the acts of their children and will be booked as a menace to the health of the entire community." Unquote. To understand why, in 1937, Charles Berry had to busy himself burying poop that he had fished out of an irrigation ditch in the California desert. And in 1939 and 1940, Fred Ross had to clean errant jobs off the floors and the walls of a sanitary unit in the San Joaquin Valley. We need to consider the sanitary aspect of the camp program from a couple of different perspectives. How did camp program workers want migrants to dispose of their waste and why? What sorts of ritual prescriptions governed migrants' approaches to defecation? New dealers wanted migrants first to view human waste as a contaminant, and second, to use modern technologies to dispose of it. Excrement was something to be deposited indoors individually, privately, and then as quickly as possible flushed away. The communal use of a pit privy, whether topped by an outhouse or a few simple boards, was, in the eyes of camp officials and administrators, disordered and dangerous behavior. Defecating in ways other than the camp program's modern approach was both retrograde and reckless. The new dealers were confident that with the availability of modern facilities and some guidance in the use of flush toilets, they could create a new awareness and new practices in migrants. When this confidence proved misplaced, as it often did, someone had to grab a shovel or a mop to address the problem of dirt. Someone also had to stand guard to put an end to the improper practice. And someone needed to remind the population of the boundary that had been crossed. For the migrants' part, the draw of the irrigation ditch over the modern toilet indicates that at least some thought differently about order and contamination than did the women and men working to redeem them in the government camps. Some of the migrants likely did not see human excrement as much of a contaminant at all, and were simply continuing the time-honored practice of leaving it where it was easiest. It is also likely that some migrants saw excrement as a contaminant, but thought that depositing it in the open air and leaving it undisturbed were ritually proper ways to handle it. One can well imagine that someone who works in the fields all day, miles removed from an outhouse, has baseline sensitivities about bodily functions that are different from those of a banker. It was surely also the case that some migrants saw human excrement as a contaminant, but as a result of years of living on the edges of ditch banks, roads, and deserts, had stopped caring about how and where they placed it. California agricultural life all but required those on its lowest strata to live lives of dirt and filth. Even if a migrant had only been comfortable defecating in a modern toilet or a well-maintained outhouse at first, circumstances forced them to forget discomfort. To this group, the irrigation ditch might have seemed as good a place as any, and a better place than most. The systems of reform and redemption established by the federal government operated on a set of assumptions about class and race, purity and technology that we see with special clarity when considering the problem of sanitation. Those who were poor and white ought to aspire to move out of poverty and to live whiter lives. The purity that reformers saw as important to whiteness was a purity born of modern technology and proper interactions with it. Entering into the sanitary unit and using it properly was a sign of acceptance of these norms and circularly of dependence on the sanitary unit to maintain them. To defecate or to urinate out of place, to ignore the pleas for regular showers, was to perform rejection of these norms, and bodily, to declare a kind of independence from the systems that preached and enforced and adjudicated them. Given this, it seems likely that at least some migrants in the new Brawley camp were using that irrigation ditch rather than a toilet to offer their response, their commentary on a system that was suffocating to and controlling of them. And to reform-minded New Deal missionaries who preached faith in and dependence on the modern. During the Great Depression, human erosion called into question not just the work of progress and civilization, but the durability of the entire American project. Concerned about possible societal contamination, federal migrant camps sought to contain, to reorder, to settle California's migrant population, and to reverse the erosion of the people. The sanitary unit, with its many material expressions of modern logics of cleanliness and sanitation, was an especially critical bulwark and ritual catechetical space for individual bodies, for people, and for a nation. As the rhetoric around the sanitary unit indicates, reformers believed that the stakes of successfully evangelizing and converting the eroded, the unredeemed, were quite high. Erosion, after all, is a process that wears something coherent down to silt. That which appeared solid and stable, able to bear weight, to anchor a tree, to serve as a foundation, slides into the water or rides the wind and is gone. Thank you.